There is a specific kind of silence that follows a conversation where you try to explain something important and watch the other person's face go politely blank. Maybe they said something supportive, but you could feel it. The gap between what you were saying and what they were actually receiving. Like speaking into a room where the acoustics are wrong. The words leave your mouth intact and arrive somewhere else as something unrecognizable. If you have felt that recently, this is for you. Not for everyone. For you specifically. The person who has been making choices that make perfect sense from the inside and look strange from the outside. The person whose ambitions have quietly outpaced the vocabulary of the people around them. The person who is tired, not of working hard, not of the climb itself, but of the low-grade exhaustion that comes from perpetually translating yourself to people who don't quite have the language yet. That exhaustion has a name, and understanding it might be the single most clarifying thing you do this year. Here is where we begin. You are sitting somewhere, maybe at the end of a long day, maybe in a car, maybe in the 15 minutes of quiet you had to fight for, and something in this title landed on you in a way that felt uncomfortably accurate. The tolerance gap. Why successful people are comfortable being misunderstood. You didn't need it explained to you. You felt it immediately. That recognition is not random. It means you are already living inside this gap, whether or not you have had the words for it. It means the distance between where you are headed and where the people around you currently stand has grown wide enough to notice. Wide enough to lose sleep over. Wide enough that you have started wondering whether the loneliness that comes with growth is actually loneliness, or whether it is something else entirely, something that has no comfortable label in ordinary conversation. Let's start with a scene. You make a decision. Maybe it's leaving a stable job for something uncertain but deeply aligned with who you are becoming. Maybe it's turning down an invitation that would have been automatic 2 years ago. Maybe it's a financial choice, a relationship boundary, a change in how you spend your mornings, something that from the inside feels like the most logical and necessary thing you have ever done. You share it with someone close to you, and the response is concern, gentle, well-meaning, genuine concern, wrapped in the language of love. Are you sure? That sounds risky. Why would you give that up? I just worry about you. None of it is cruel. All of it is sincere. And yet something inside you tightens because you recognize that what they are responding to is not your actual decision. It is their own fear of what your decision represents. Their own threshold for uncertainty. Their own internal map of what safety looks like. You are not being misunderstood because you communicated poorly. You are being misunderstood because you have moved. This is the beginning of what we'll spend the next several hours examining. The tolerance gap is not a flaw in your relationships. It is not a sign that you have become arrogant or disconnected. It is not evidence that you are wrong. It is a natural and largely unspoken consequence of genuine personal development, the widening distance between the self you are becoming and the self that the people around you were originally introduced to. Every person who has ever grown meaningfully has crossed this gap. Most of them did it without a map. What tends to happen, in the absence of understanding what the gap actually is one of two things. Either you slow down to stay comprehensible to the people around you, make yourself smaller, more familiar, more predictable, more like the version of you they are comfortable with. Or you accelerate forward alone and in the process develop a kind of hardness, a protective distance that closes you off from the depth of connection you actually want. Neither of those is the answer. The answer is something more nuanced, more demanding, and ultimately more freeing than either option. It requires understanding what the gap is made of, where it comes from, and what it costs you to either collapse it or ignore it entirely. It requires a level of psychological honesty that most personal development content does not ask of you, because most personal development content is more interested in making you feel good than in making you think clearly. This is not that kind of content. This is the kind of content that sits with you in the uncomfortable in-between. The place where you are genuinely becoming someone new and you are not quite sure yet who that person is allowed to be. The place where your ambitions feel real and your doubts feel equally real, and the people who love you are responding to an older version of you that no longer fully exists. You are in the middle of something, and the middle is precisely where clarity is hardest to find, which is exactly why it is where clarity matters most. Over the course of this listening experience, we are going to do something specific. We are going to build a complete picture of what the tolerance gap is, how it forms, what it costs you when you mismanage it, and how the most successful people, not the loudest, not the most performative, but the ones who sustain real growth over the long term, learn to inhabit it with something that eventually begins to feel like grace. Not indifference, not isolation, grace. There is a version of being misunderstood that destroys people. There is another version that quietly shapes them into exactly who they were built to become. The difference between those two outcomes is not talent, not luck, not circumstances. It is a specific set of psychological skills that almost nobody explicitly teaches, and almost everybody who succeeds quietly develops along the way. We are going to make those skills explicit. We are going to name the thing that has been living in the background of your most important decisions, your most strained conversations, your most private moments of doubt and certainty existing at the same time. And we are going to start, as all honest examinations of human behavior must start, at the very beginning. Not at your beginning, but at the beginning of the need itself. The need to be understood, where it comes from, what it was designed to do, and why, without realizing it, most people allow it to quietly govern choices that have nothing to do with connection and everything to do with fear. That is where we go next. Before you were ambitious, you were a child who needed to be read correctly, not metaphorically, literally. The ability to be understood by the people who cared for you was not a preference in early life. It was a survival mechanism. When you cried and someone came, when you pointed and someone looked, when you were afraid and someone recognized it without you having the words, those moments were not just emotionally comforting. They were neurologically formative. They taught your nervous system something it would carry for decades. Being understood means being safe. That equation was true once. It is not as true as you think it is now. But the body doesn't automatically update its operating system just because the circumstances have changed. The nervous system that learned understood equals safe in childhood does not receive a memo at age 24 that says the equation has become more complicated. It just keeps running the same program in a world that now demands something far more sophisticated. This is where most conversations about ambition and growth miss something critical. They talk about mindset as if it is purely a cognitive exercise. Think differently, reframe your beliefs, choose a better story. And those things are real and useful, but they skip the layer underneath, the physiological, almost cellular reality that the need for approval is not a weakness of character. It is a feature of your design. Understanding that distinction matters more than most people realize. When you shame yourself for caring too much what others think, you are essentially criticizing your nervous system for doing exactly what it was trained to do. That is not a productive place to work from. The more useful question is not, why do I care what people think, but rather, when did caring what people think stop serving me, and what is it costing me now? Those are different questions. The first one leads to self-criticism. The second one leads somewhere useful. Here is what the research on social belonging consistently shows, and what you can verify simply by observing your own life. Human beings are not wired for isolation. The need to belong, to be seen, to be accurately perceived by others, is not vanity. It is one of the most deeply embedded drives in the human psychological system, sitting alongside hunger and fear in terms of its motivational power. When that need goes unmet, the brain registers it similarly to physical pain, not metaphorically similar, neurologically similar. So when you feel the sting of being misunderstood by someone whose opinion matters to you, you are not being oversensitive, you are being human. The problem is not the feeling. The problem is the decision you make in response to the feeling. There is a particular pattern that emerges in people who are bright, driven, and interpersonally aware, the kind of person who is likely listening to something like this. The pattern looks like this. You feel the pain of being misunderstood, and your immediate instinct is to close the gap through explanation. You try harder to articulate your reasoning. You add context. You soften the edges of your position. You look for the angle that will finally make this person see what you are seeing. And sometimes it works. Sometimes you find the right frame and the other person genuinely follows you there. And the connection is real and the understanding is mutual and everything you hoped for materializes. But sometimes, more often than you want to admit, it doesn't work. Not because you explained poorly, but because the gap you are trying to close is not a communication gap. It is an experience gap, a values gap, a gap in what each of you has been willing to risk, willing to question, willing to walk toward in the dark. You cannot explain your way across that kind of gap. And the repeated attempt to do so is where something quietly begins to break down. Because every time you contort your thinking to fit inside someone else's comprehension, every time you soften a conviction to make it more palatable, every time you pre-edit your ambitions before sharing them because you already know how they will land, you are making a small withdrawal from something you cannot afford to keep depleting. Your own internal authority. The sense that your perceptions of your own life are trustworthy, that your instincts about your own path are valid, that you are, in fact, a reliable narrator of your own experience. When you spend enough time translating yourself for audiences who weren't ready for the original, you can begin to lose confidence in the original. You start to wonder whether the confusion in other people's eyes is evidence that something is wrong with your vision rather than evidence that your vision has simply grown beyond the shared frame. That is the slow damage. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just a gradual erosion of self-trust dressed up as social sensitivity. And it tends to happen most to the people who are most emotionally intelligent, because they are the ones who can feel the discomfort in the room most acutely. They are the ones who are most capable of reading what someone needs and adjusting accordingly. The very skill that makes them good at relationships becomes the mechanism by which their own development gets quietly negotiated away. There is something else worth naming here. The approval-seeking pattern does not always announce itself loudly. It doesn't always look like desperation or insecurity in the obvious sense. Sometimes it looks like over-explaining. Sometimes it looks like preemptively downplaying your wins before someone else can be uncomfortable with them. Sometimes it looks like the habit of always framing your choices in terms of what they mean for other people rather than what they mean for you. Sometimes it looks like being the most reasonable person in the room, always. Always calibrating, always moderating, always making sure nobody feels left behind or threatened or diminished by the fact of your growth. That version of approval-seeking is the hardest to see because it wears the costume of maturity and consideration. But there is a difference between being considerate and being self-erasing. And the person who cannot yet tell the difference between those two things will spend years mistaking one for the other. What we are building toward over the course of this listening is the capacity to hold both things at once. To be genuinely caring toward the people in your life and simultaneously unapologetic about the direction your life is taking. To close real communication gaps with patience and skill, and to leave experience gaps alone, because no amount of explaining will substitute for the time and risk and loss that create the kind of understanding you are actually looking for. That requires something specific. It requires understanding what the tolerance gap actually is, not as a metaphor, but as a precise psychological phenomenon with a structure you can learn to recognize. And that is exactly where we are going. Every person who has ever grown beyond their original circumstances carries a version of this experience, even if they never found the language for it. You make a change. You develop a new standard. You begin thinking at a different altitude about your time, your money, your relationships, your future. And for a while, you try to bring everyone with you. You share what you are learning. You explain the shift in how you see things. You invite people into the new frame. And then one day, quietly, without any dramatic announcement, you stop. Not because you gave up on the people, but because you finally recognized something. The gap between where you are thinking and where they are currently standing is not a gap you can bridge through conversation alone. It is a gap that only time, experience, and a person's own willingness to question themselves can close. That moment of recognition, that specific, quiet, slightly lonely moment, is the first real encounter with what we are calling the tolerance gap. Here is the clearest way to define it. The tolerance gap is the psychological and experiential distance between the person you are actively becoming and the version of you that the people in your immediate environment are still responding to. It is the space between your current internal reality and the external narrative that the people around you are still operating from. And it exists not because anyone is foolish or cruel or unsupportive. It exists because growth is inherently asymmetric. You are living your evolution in real time. Everyone else is watching it from the outside, at a delay, through the filter of their own frame of reference. That delay is not failure, it is physics. Think about light from distant stars. By the time it reaches your eye, the star itself may have changed entirely. What you are seeing is accurate. It is real light from a real source, but it is not current. It is a true picture of something that no longer exists in quite that form. That is often what the people who love you are seeing when they look at you. A true picture, just not a current one. And here is where the tolerance gap becomes psychologically significant. Most people, when they encounter this gap, do one of three things. They collapse it by shrinking themselves back to a recognizable shape. They ignore it by emotionally distancing from the people on the other side of it. Or they exhaust themselves trying to accelerate other people's understanding through sheer force of explanation. None of these responses are wrong, exactly. They are all understandable. But none of them are sustainable, and none of them address what is actually happening. What is actually happening is this. Your identity is in transition. And identity transitions, real ones, not surface-level rebranding, but the deep structural kind where your values and your risk tolerance and your sense of what is possible all shift simultaneously. These are inherently disorienting to the people around you. Because when you change at that level, you are not just updating your preferences. You are implicitly changing the shared story. The shared story is more powerful than most people realize. Every close relationship, every family system, every long-term friendship runs on a shared story. A mutually agreed-upon narrative about who each person is, what they are capable of, what they want, what they are afraid of. That story creates coherence. It creates predictability. It creates the kind of comfort that allows people to relax in each other's presence. When you grow significantly, you are not just changing yourself. You are editing the shared story without the other person's consent, and people resist that edit, not maliciously, but instinctively, because shared stories are part of how we organize our sense of reality. This is why the resistance you feel is rarely about your specific decision. It is about the destabilization your growth creates in someone else's internal landscape. Understanding that distinction will change how you respond to pushback. Because once you understand that the concern people express about your choices is often really about their own need for narrative stability, you stop taking it as evidence that your choices are wrong. You start hearing it for what it is, a person managing their own disorientation in the only vocabulary they currently have. That does not mean you dismiss them. It means you stop letting their disorientation become your compass. The tolerance gap has a width and it has a texture. The width is determined by how much you have grown relative to a shared starting point. Two people who were peers 5 years ago, but who have taken radically different approaches to risk, learning, and self-examination, will have a wider gap than two people who have grown at similar rates in similar directions. The gap is not a judgment, it is a measurement. The texture is determined by what kind of growth created the distance. Financial growth creates a particular kind of gap, one often loaded with the complicated emotions of class, obligation, and survival. Intellectual growth creates another kind, one that can feel like condescension to the person on the other side, even when none is intended. Emotional growth, paradoxically, can create one of the widest gaps of all, because when you develop a higher capacity for self-awareness, the people who haven't done that work can feel uncomfortably exposed in your presence without knowing exactly why. You have probably experienced at least one of these. You may have experienced all three at once. And here is the thing about the tolerance gap that nobody prepares you for. The gap does not feel triumphant. It does not feel like a reward for your hard work. In the early stages, it mostly feels like loss. The loss of easy understanding, the loss of a certain kind of belonging, the loss of the comfort that comes from being fully legible to the people you love. That loss is real. It should be honored, not dismissed. But it is not the end of the story. The gap, when understood and navigated with intention, becomes something else entirely over time. It becomes the exact distance inside which your truest self has the room it needs to fully form. It is not a void. It is not abandonment. It is the necessary breathing room of genuine transformation. And the first step toward navigating it well is simply understanding that it exists, that it is normal, and that what you do inside it matters enormously. Because what most people do inside the tolerance gap is where everything begins to either compound or collapse. Nobody warns you about this part. The books on ambition talk about the climb. They talk about discipline and vision and the willingness to outwork everyone in the room. The content about personal development talks about breaking limiting beliefs and stepping into your potential and building the life you were meant to live. And all of that has its place, but almost none of it talks about what it actually feels like in the middle of a real transition. Not the dramatic middle, where everything is visibly in motion and the stakes are obvious. The quiet middle, the Tuesday afternoon middle, the middle where you are doing the work, making the progress, becoming someone genuinely new, and the primary emotional texture of the experience is not triumph. It is a specific, low-grade, surprisingly persistent loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation. You are probably surrounded by people, not the loneliness of being unloved. The people in your life very likely love you deeply. This is a different kind. It is the loneliness of being in a room full of people who are responding to a version of you that you have already moved past. It is the loneliness of being slightly out of sync with every conversation you're in. If you have felt this, you know exactly what it sounds like. It sounds like a conversation that keeps returning to old reference points as though those reference points still fully apply. It sounds like advice that was genuinely helpful 3 years ago, arriving as though nothing has changed. It sounds like enthusiasm for your life that somehow manages to be both sincere and slightly off-target, because the person offering it is tracking a trajectory that you quietly redirected months ago. None of it is anyone's fault. That is the hardest part to hold on to. Because when something hurts and nobody is to blame, there is nowhere clean to put the feeling. You can't be angry. You can't demand that it be fixed. You can't point at the specific moment it went wrong, because there wasn't one. There was just growth, yours, happening at its own pace, in its own direction, and the natural consequence of that growth is a kind of relational lag that no amount of goodwill entirely eliminates. So what do people do with that feeling? Most of the time they do one of two things. They pathologize it, decide that feeling lonely amid growth is evidence that they are doing something wrong, that real success should feel more connected and more joyful and more universally celebrated, and therefore the loneliness is a signal to course correct. Or they weaponize it, use it as evidence that the people around them are simply not capable of understanding them, build a narrative of intellectual or emotional superiority around the gap, and begin relating to their own growth as something that separates them from ordinary people rather than something that belongs to a shared human experience. Both of those responses are understandable. Both of them are also quietly destructive. The first response, pathologizing the loneliness, keeps people smaller than they need to be. It turns the natural emotional cost of growth into a reason to stop growing. It creates a ceiling that feels like sensitivity, but functions like fear. The person who takes this route will often find themselves repeatedly approaching the edge of real transformation and then retreating, not because the path is wrong, but because the emotional weather at that altitude is unfamiliar, and the instinct is to return to more comfortable terrain. The second response, weaponizing the loneliness, creates a different kind of damage. It turns the gap into an identity. The person who takes this route begins to define themselves by their distance from others rather than by the direction they are moving. They start to wear misunderstanding as a badge rather than experiencing it as a natural growing pain. And in doing so, they often close themselves off from the very connections and collaborations and moments of genuine mutual recognition that would make the journey not just successful, but actually worth having made. There is a third way. It is quieter than either of those options. It is less immediately satisfying. It does not offer the comfort of self-correction or the stimulation of superiority, but it is the only response that actually serves you over the long term. It is simply this: to allow the loneliness of the gap to be what it is, without making it mean more than it means. It does not mean you are wrong. It does not mean you are better. It does not mean you are broken or arrogant or ahead of your time in some romanticized sense. It means you are in motion. It means the distance between where you started and where you are going has become visible enough to feel. It means the growth is real. The loneliness is the proof of the progress. Not proof that you have arrived somewhere. Proof that you are genuinely moving. There is something else that happens in this stage that almost nobody talks about honestly. The people who are closest to you, the ones who know the earlier version of you most intimately, will sometimes experience your growth as a kind of loss. Not because they are selfish, because they are human. When you change significantly, they lose something too. They lose the predictability of you. They lose the version of the relationship they had learned to count on. They lose the particular comfort of being with someone whose edges they knew completely. That loss in them will sometimes come out as concern for you. It will sometimes come out as skepticism about your choices. It will sometimes come out as a subtle but persistent pressure to return to form, to be the version of yourself they are most fluent in. And here is the thing you need to understand about that pressure. It is not a request for you to stop growing. It is a grief response wearing the costume of practical concern. And it deserves to be received with compassion, not as a directive. You can love someone through their grief about your growth and still keep growing. Those two things are not in conflict, but holding both of them at once requires something specific. It requires a level of emotional steadiness that is very difficult to maintain when you are simultaneously managing your own grief about the gap, your own mourning for the ease of connection that existed before the distance became visible, your own quiet ache for the version of belonging that does not require you to carry the weight of being perpetually ahead of the conversation. That steadiness is not something you either have or don't have. It is something that gets built, slowly, through repeated encounters with the gap and the gradual accumulation of evidence that you can move through it without losing either your direction or your humanity. But before you can build it, you have to understand what threatens it most. And what threatens it most is something far more deliberate than ordinary misunderstanding. There is a difference between being misunderstood and being managed. Most people never learn to tell the two apart. And that inability, that failure to distinguish between someone who simply cannot yet grasp where you are going and someone who is actively invested in keeping you where you are, is one of the most expensive blind spots a growing person can carry. Ordinary misunderstanding is passive. It is the natural result of two people operating from different levels of experience and different internal maps. It does not require anyone to be calculating or unkind. It just requires a gap in shared reference points, and time will often close it, or at least make it navigable. What we are talking about now is something different. It is the way that your need to be understood, that deep neurologically rooted drive we examined earlier, can be used as a lever by people who are, consciously or not, threatened by your growth. And the reason this is worth examining carefully is not to make you paranoid. It is not to encourage you to view your relationships through a lens of suspicion. It is because this dynamic is extraordinarily common, almost universally unspoken, and it tends to operate most powerfully on the people who are least likely to recognize it. Precisely because those people are the ones with the highest capacity for empathy and the strongest instinct to extend generous interpretations to the behavior of people they love. Here is how it typically works. You share something, a plan, a decision, a change in direction, an ambition that has been quietly forming for months. You share it because you trust the person, because their opinion matters to you, Because some part of you is hoping for the particular relief that comes from being genuinely seen and supported by someone who knows you well. And the response you get is not hostile. It is careful. It arrives wrapped in concern, in questions that sound reasonable on the surface, but carry an undertone of doubt, in references to past failures or past vulnerabilities that are framed as relevant context, but function as anchors. In a kind of supportive skepticism that leaves you feeling simultaneously cared for and subtly diminished. You walk away from the conversation not quite as certain as you were when you walked in. And that, quietly, was the point. Not always consciously. This is important to understand. Most of the people who engage in this dynamic are not sitting somewhere calculating how to undermine you. They are responding from their own fear. Fear that your growth will change the relationship. Fear that your success will redefine the terms of a dynamic they have grown comfortable with. Fear that if you become fully who you are capable of becoming, the version of themselves they have settled into will feel insufficient by comparison. That fear is real. It deserves compassion. But compassion does not require you to absorb its consequences. There is a particular phrase that tends to appear in these conversations. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like someone who cares about you being honest with you in a way that less devoted people wouldn't bother to be. It sounds like this: I just want to make sure you're being realistic. Realistic. That word has ended more promising trajectories than almost any other word in the English language. Not because reality doesn't matter, it does, enormously, but because in this context, realistic almost never means let's examine the actual evidence. It means let's return to the shared story we both agreed to before you started changing it. It means come back to where I can understand you. It means stop moving so fast. It means you are making me uncomfortable, and I need you to moderate yourself until I catch up, except I am framing that need as concern for your well-being rather than as a request for my own comfort. Again, this is usually not malicious. But the effect is the same whether the intent is malicious or not. The effect is that your own internal authority gets quietly negotiated away in the name of being reasonable, being careful, being considerate of the people who love you. And here is the specific mechanism by which your need to be understood becomes the lever. Because you care about being understood. Because the gap between your internal reality and the external narrative feels uncomfortable. Because you are emotionally intelligent enough to feel the concern in the room and responsive enough to want to address it. Because of all of those things, you are vulnerable to a particular kind of verbal dynamic where the price of feeling understood is accepting a slightly diminished version of your own vision. You explain more. You soften the edges. You add qualifiers. You emphasize the responsible aspects of your plan. You preemptively address the concerns before they are even fully voiced. And with each of those adjustments, you move slightly further from the original clarity you started with. By the time the conversation ends, you have achieved a kind of understanding. They understand you now. But what they understand is the edited version, the manageable version, the version that fits inside the frame they were comfortable with before you started talking. Recognizing this pattern is not about becoming guarded or withholding. It is not about deciding that sharing your inner life is too dangerous and building walls accordingly. It is about developing a very specific skill that high achievers eventually learn, usually through painful experience rather than deliberate practice. The skill is this: knowing who has earned the right to hear the unedited version of your thinking. Not everyone has, not because they are bad people, but because trust in the context of growth is not just about loyalty or love or history. It is about whether a person's own relationship with risk and change and uncertainty is developed enough that they can hold your vision without flinching and without needing to reshape it into something less threatening to their own sense of what is possible. Most people in your life are rooting for you. Fewer of them can actually handle the full weight of what you are becoming. And learning to tell the difference, not with bitterness but with clarity, is one of the most protective and most underrated skills available to anyone in the middle of genuine growth. Because when you stop offering your most vulnerable thinking to people who are not yet equipped to receive it, something interesting happens. You stop needing their understanding in order to move forward. You stop waiting for permission that was never theirs to give. You stop experiencing every conversation as a referendum on whether your vision is valid. And you begin, slowly, to locate the source of your certainty somewhere that cannot be negotiated away. That relocation, from external validation to internal authority, is the subject of where we are headed. But first, we need to look honestly at what it costs you when you don't make that shift. When you stay inside the approval loop, long past the point where it is serving you. Because the cost is specific, and it is higher than most people want to calculate. There is a tax that nobody puts on the invoice. It does not show up in your bank account. It does not appear in your performance review. Nobody pulls you aside and tells you that you have been paying it, or how long you have been paying it, or how much has quietly accumulated. It is the kind of cost that only becomes visible in retrospect, when you look back at a period of your life and notice a strange flatness in it, a sense of motion without momentum, of effort without arrival, of working hard and somehow staying approximately in place. The approval loop is that tax, and the specific way it collects is worth understanding in precise terms, because vague awareness of a problem almost never produces change. What produces change is being able to see the mechanism clearly enough that you cannot unsee it. Here is the mechanism. Every time you seek approval before acting on something you already know to be right, you insert a delay, not always a long one. Sometimes just a conversation, a few hours, an afternoon spent waiting for someone's response before you allow yourself to feel certain. But the delay is real, and delays compound. Across weeks and months and years, the habit of checking with others before trusting yourself creates a pattern in which your own judgment is perpetually in second position. You become, without intending to, someone who thinks well but acts slowly. Someone who generates good ideas but moves on them only after they have been ratified by a council of people whose relationship with risk is, on average, more conservative than yours. Someone who has genuine vision but who has trained themselves to hold it at arm's length until it receives external permission to become real. That pattern does not feel like self-sabotage. It feels like wisdom. It feels like collaboration. It feels like the responsible acknowledgement that you do not have all the answers and that the people around you have valuable perspectives. And all of that is true in appropriate measure. The problem is not consultation. The problem is the specific emotional need underneath the consultation, the need to be understood and approved before you trust yourself to proceed. Because that need means the consultation is never really about gathering information. It is about managing your own anxiety. And managing anxiety through external validation is one of the most expensive habits a person can develop, for a very specific reason. It works. In the short term, it works beautifully. You share your plan. Someone affirms it. The anxiety recedes. You feel certain enough to move. The relief is real. The forward motion is real. And so the habit gets reinforced over and over until seeking approval before acting becomes as automatic as any other anxiety management strategy. The long-term cost of that habit arrives in several forms. The first is speed. The person who moves on, clear internal conviction, will almost always outpace the person who requires external ratification before acting. Not because they make better decisions in isolation, sometimes they don't, but because the compounding effect of faster iteration is enormous over time. A year of moving at 70% speed because you are waiting for approval produces a fundamentally different result than a year of moving at full speed and course-correcting as you go. The second cost is quality of thinking. This one is subtler and more damaging. When you habitually pre-edit your ideas for an audience before you have fully developed them yourself, you start to think inside the frame of what will be acceptable rather than what is actually true. Your cognition begins to optimize for palatability rather than accuracy, and over time, this means that your best thinking, your most original, most challenging, most genuinely valuable thinking, never fully forms because it gets edited out before it reaches the page, replaced by the safer version that you already know will land without friction. The world loses something when that happens. You lose something. The third cost is the one that tends to land hardest when people finally see it clearly. It is the cost to your identity, the sense of self, the internal experience of knowing who you are and trusting that knowledge. When you spend years seeking approval before acting, you gradually externalize your sense of authority. You begin to feel, at a level below conscious articulation, that your judgment is a rough draft that requires editing by others before it becomes final. That your perceptions of your own life are proposals rather than conclusions. That the verdict on your choices belongs to a committee you did not consciously elect, but have been faithfully consulting for as long as you can remember. That externalization is quiet, and it is cumulative. And it is one of the primary reasons that genuinely intelligent, capable, self-aware people can find themselves in their 30s or 40s with a persistent background feeling that they have not yet fully arrived at their own life, that they are still somehow waiting for something, waiting to feel certain enough, waiting for enough external confirmation, waiting for the version of themselves that will finally feel legitimate without needing to be ratified. The waiting is the cost. Not the waiting itself, but what is lost inside it. The decisions not made with full conviction. The risks not taken because the committee was split. The version of your life that existed in your clearest moments of private vision but never quite materialized because you kept returning to people who could see what you had done but could not yet see what you were capable of. There is something else that happens inside the approval loop that is worth naming directly. The more you seek approval from a particular person or group, the more power you inadvertently grant them over your emotional state. Not because they took it, because you offered it. And once that dynamic is established, it becomes self-reinforcing in a way that can feel almost impossible to interrupt. Because now it is not just your decisions that require their endorsement. It is your mood, your confidence, your sense of whether a given day was good or bad. The approval loop, in its most advanced form, means that your internal weather is largely determined by external inputs that you do not control and cannot predict. That is an extraordinarily vulnerable position for an ambitious person to occupy. And the exit from that position is not a dramatic confrontation or a clean break or a sudden decision to stop caring what anyone thinks. Those approaches rarely work and often create unnecessary damage. The exit is something quieter and more structural. It is learning to reframe what being misunderstood actually means, not as evidence of a communication failure or a relationship failure or a personal failure, but as something with an entirely different and far more useful interpretation. That reframe does not come naturally. It has to be built deliberately. And that is precisely where we go next. There is a moment that most growing people eventually reach, though very few can identify it clearly while they are inside it. It is the moment when you realize that the confusion on someone else's face is not a problem you need to solve. That sounds simple. It is not. Because everything in your social wiring, everything that was installed in you during the years when being understood actually was a survival issue, pushes against that realization. The discomfort of being misread by someone you respect does not feel like neutral information. It feels like an alarm, and alarms demand response. The reframe we are building here is not about silencing that alarm. It is about learning to interpret it differently. To hear it not as something is wrong, but as something has changed. Not as a signal of failure, but as a signal of distance traveled. Here is where the reframe begins. Think about the last time someone genuinely could not follow your reasoning on something you felt clear about. Not because you explained it poorly, not because the idea was flawed, but because the leap you were making, the connection between where you are now and where you can see yourself going, required a set of experiences they had not yet had, required a tolerance for uncertainty they had not yet developed, required a relationship with risk that looked fundamentally different from the one they were currently living inside. Their inability to follow you was not a verdict on your direction. It was a map of the distance between your current positions. That is the reframe. Not, I failed to communicate, and not, they failed to understand, but simply, we are standing in different places, looking at different horizons, and what is visible from where I am standing is not yet visible from where they are standing. That is a factual description of a geographic reality. It carries no blame and requires no defense. When you can hold that frame consistently, something shifts in how you move through the world. You stop entering important conversations with the implicit goal of achieving understanding. You enter them with a different goal entirely: connection. And connection does not require comprehension. It requires presence, genuine care, and the willingness to be in relationship with someone even across a significant gap in shared perspective. Those are different skills than explanation. Explanation tries to collapse the gap. Connection allows the gap to exist while maintaining the relationship across it. And paradoxically, people who stop trying to explain themselves into being understood often find that genuine understanding arrives more naturally. Not because they pursued it, but because they stopped making it a prerequisite for every interaction. There is a shift that high performers make, usually somewhere in the middle chapter of their development, that is almost never discussed explicitly, but is nearly universal among people who sustain meaningful growth over the long term. They stop reading other people's confusion as feedback about themselves. This is not the same as becoming indifferent to feedback. Feedback is essential. The ability to receive accurate, honest, well-considered feedback from people whose judgment you trust is one of the most valuable capacities a person can develop. The skill we are talking about here is not about dismissing external input. It is about developing a very precise filter for which external inputs belong in which category. There is feedback that is about your execution, about how you are doing something, about the quality of your thinking, the soundness of your strategy, the clarity of your communication. That kind of feedback is often invaluable regardless of its source, and the person who can receive it without defensiveness has a significant advantage over the person who cannot. And then there is the response that is not really feedback at all. It is a reaction to the fact of your growth, to the disruption your evolution creates in a shared narrative, to the discomfort your forward motion generates in people whose own motion has slowed or stopped. That reaction often arrives wearing the costume of feedback. It uses feedback language. It sounds considered and specific. But underneath the language, what it is really expressing is, "I do not recognize you anymore," and that frightens me. Learning to tell those two things apart is one of the most practically useful skills in the entire landscape of personal development. And here is the most reliable way to tell them apart. Genuine feedback makes you think. It opens something in your reasoning. It adds a dimension you had not considered or sharpens a dimension you had blurred. Even when it is uncomfortable, even when it challenges something you were attached to, genuine feedback leaves you feeling more capable of navigating your situation than you were before you received it. Reactive input, dressed as feedback, does the opposite. It makes you smaller. It does not add dimension. It removes it. It does not sharpen your thinking. It clouds it. It leaves you feeling less certain, less capable, less clear about your own direction than you were before the conversation began. And crucially, the doubt it produces is not the productive kind of doubt that leads to better decisions. It is the paralyzing kind that leads to delay, second-guessing, and the slow erosion of conviction. When a conversation consistently leaves you feeling less like yourself, that is information. Not information that the other person is wrong or bad or unsupportive. Information about the nature of what is being exchanged. Information about whether the gap between you has become wide enough that the conversational dynamic is no longer primarily generative. And what do you do with that information? You do not necessarily do anything dramatic with it. You do not announce it or act on it in any way that requires a confrontation. You simply file it accurately. You place it in the correct category. You stop sending your most vulnerable, most unfinished, most forward-leaning thinking into a space where it will be met with reactions that are really about someone else's relationship with change. You become, in a very specific and intentional way, more selective, not colder, not more guarded in the blanket sense of that word, more precise, more deliberate about which conversations happen in which rooms, more attentive to who in your life has the particular combination of care and capacity that makes them genuinely useful to think alongside. Because there is a version of selectivity that closes people off from the world, and there is a version that opens them to a different quality of connection, one that does not require the constant expenditure of energy that comes from trying to be understood by people who are not yet equipped to understand. The second version is what we are building toward. And it starts with the question of what actually happens to the relationships in your life when the gap widens. Who adjusts? who drifts, and what the movement of people toward and away from you reveals about the foundations beneath everything you have built. Not everyone leaves. This is the part of the story that the more dramatic narratives about growth tend to skip over, because departure is cinematic and loyalty is quiet. The story of someone who shed their entire former life in pursuit of their vision and emerged alone and transformed makes for compelling content. The quieter, truer story about the people who stayed and what their staying actually meant and what it cost them too, that story is harder to tell and more important to understand. Because the tolerance gap does not uniformly push people away, it sorts them. And the sorting, when you watch it carefully and honestly over time, reveals something about the nature of your relationships that you could not have seen any other way. You cannot know what a relationship is built on until it is placed under the particular kind of pressure that comes from one person changing significantly, while the other person's life remains relatively stable. That pressure is not a threat to real relationships. It is a test of what they are actually made of. Some relationships, you will discover, were built primarily on shared circumstance. The same neighborhood, the same job, the same phase of life, the same particular version of struggle or aspiration. Those relationships are real while the circumstances hold. They can be warm and generous and genuinely sustaining in the moment. But when the circumstances change, when one person's life moves into a different register, the relationship often has no other foundation to stand on. It does not collapse dramatically, it just gradually loses its footing. Conversations become less frequent. The shared reference points thin out. A comfortable distance settles in that neither person quite names. That is not failure. That is the natural end of a chapter. Other relationships, you will discover, were built on something more durable, not on shared circumstance, but on genuine mutual recognition, on the specific pleasure of being in the presence of a particular mind and a particular character, on a kind of care that is not contingent on you remaining predictable or familiar or easy to categorize. These relationships do not require you to stay the same in order to survive. They require something different. They require honesty. They require the willingness to navigate the awkward in-between period where the gap is wide enough to feel but not yet wide enough to have produced a new shared language. They require both people to be willing to do the harder work of staying curious about who the other person is becoming, rather than simply relating to who they already were. That work is not comfortable, but it produces something that the circumstance-based relationships never could. It produces the experience of being known, not recognized, not familiar. Known. The specific, rare, quietly profound experience of being in the presence of someone who sees the current version of you accurately and chooses to be there anyway. Not the version you were 5 years ago, not the version they would prefer you to be for the sake of their own comfort, the actual you in motion, in transition, with all the uncertainty and forward momentum that entails. That experience is what most people are really looking for when they seek to be understood. Not the relief of having their choices ratified, not the comfort of having their fears dissolved by someone else's confidence, but the deeper thing underneath all of that, the experience of being genuinely witnessed by another human being who is not trying to edit you into something more manageable. The people in your life who offer that are among the most valuable things you will ever have. And one of the unintended gifts of the tolerance gap, when you move through it with honesty rather than defensiveness, is that it makes those people visible. Because when the easy, circumstance-based connections begin to loosen, the deeper ones become clear by contrast. You begin to see, with a precision that was not available before, exactly who in your life is actually tracking you versus who is tracking the idea of you they assembled years ago and have not updated since. Both of those people may love you. The distinction is not about love. The distinction is about capacity. The capacity to remain in genuine relationship with someone who is in motion. The capacity to hold your own anxiety about another person's change without converting that anxiety into pressure for them to slow down. The capacity to say, honestly, I don't fully understand where you're going, but I trust you, and I'm interested in finding out. That capacity is not universal. It is not even common. When you find it in someone, you are in the presence of something rare. And here is the other side of this, the side that requires the most honesty. The tolerance gap runs in both directions. As you grow, you will encounter people who are ahead of you, people whose thinking operates at an altitude that you cannot yet fully reach, people whose choices look strange or reckless or incomprehensible from where you currently stand. And in those moments, you are on the other side of the gap. You are the one whose comprehension is lagging. You are the one whose concern might really be discomfort wearing the costume of care. How you behave in those moments is a precise measure of your actual development. Not your development as measured by your income or your title or the distance you have traveled from your starting point. Your development as a human being capable of genuine relationship across difference. The person who can receive growth in others without feeling threatened by it, without needing to compete with it or diminish it or reshape it into something less disorienting, that person has developed something that most metrics of success will never capture. They have developed the capacity for what might be called relational generosity, the willingness to remain curious about someone else's evolution even when it moves faster than your own, even when it challenges your own sense of what is possible, even when it quietly asks you to update a shared story you are comfortable with. Relational generosity is what allows the people in your life to grow without the growth becoming a threat to the bond between you. It is what makes the difference between a relationship that survives the gap and one that becomes defined by it. And it is worth asking, honestly, whether you extend it as readily as you hope to receive it. Because the person who wants to be understood across the tolerance gap but cannot offer understanding across it in return is not yet as far along as they think they are. That honesty is uncomfortable. It is also necessary. Because what comes next, the construction of a genuine internal compass, requires a level of self-honesty that cannot coexist with a blind spot that large. At some point, the search for understanding has to turn inward, not as a retreat, not as a consolation prize for failing to find it outside, but as a deliberate and mature recognition that the kind of certainty you have been looking for, the deep, settled, unshakable sense that you are on the right path, was never going to come from outside sources in the first place. Not because outside sources are unreliable, though sometimes they are, but because the specific quality of certainty you need for the kind of growth you are pursuing is not transferable. It cannot be handed to you. It can only be built from the inside through a process that is quiet and unglamorous and takes considerably longer than anyone wants it to. This is the section where we talk about what actually replaces the approval loop. Because here is the thing that most conversations about self-reliance and internal validation get wrong. They frame it as a subtraction. Stop seeking approval. Stop caring what others think. Stop needing external validation. And all of that sounds right in theory and tends to produce very little in practice because you cannot build a stable internal architecture by simply removing the external scaffolding. If you take away the scaffolding before the structure can support itself, you do not get freedom, you get collapse. What you need is not less external input. What you need is a different primary source. And that different primary source is not confidence in the conventional sense. It is not the feeling of certainty that arrives when things are going well and your choices are producing visible results and the people around you are nodding in agreement. That kind of confidence is real, but it is also entirely dependent on circumstances, which means it is available precisely when you need it least and absent precisely when you need it most. What we are talking about is something more structural than confidence. It is the development of a personal standard of evidence. Here is what that means in practice. Most people, when evaluating whether a decision is right, are primarily consulting how it feels in the context of other people's responses. Does this feel defensible? Does this feel explainable? Does this feel like something the people whose opinions matter to me will be able to follow and support? Those are the questions running in the background, often below conscious awareness, shaping the choices that feel like free decisions, but are actually deeply contingent on the anticipated reactions of others. A personal standard of evidence replaces those questions with different ones. Not better in a moralistic sense, different in a structural sense. The questions become, is this consistent with the direction I have identified as mine? Does this align with the values I have actually examined and chosen, rather than inherited and never questioned? When I imagine myself 2 years from now looking back at this decision, does the version of me that has continued to develop in the direction I am moving feel at peace with it or not? Those questions do not produce instant answers. They require a quality of self-knowledge that takes time to develop. And that is precisely the point. Building a personal standard of evidence is a long-term project, not a technique you deploy in a single conversation. It is the accumulated result of repeatedly asking yourself honest questions and sitting with the answers long enough to learn the difference between what you actually think and what you think you are supposed to think. Most people have never done that work in any sustained way. Not because they are incapable of it, because nobody explicitly told them it was necessary. The educational systems most of us moved through were primarily designed to teach us how to meet external standards, how to produce work that satisfied the requirements of someone else's rubric. The professional systems most of us operate inside continue that training. Meet the target, satisfy the metric, receive the validation, adjust based on the feedback. The entire architecture of formal development is externally oriented by design, and that design is not wrong for its stated purpose. But it produces, as a side effect, adults who are highly skilled at meeting external standards and significantly underdeveloped in their capacity to generate and trust internal ones. Building that capacity requires practice, specific, deliberate practice. The first element of that practice is solitude, not isolation, not withdrawal from the world, but the regular protected experience of being with your own thinking without immediately exporting it for evaluation. Most people in contemporary professional life are chronically underexposed to their own unmediated thought. Between the constant availability of other people's opinions through every device and platform and the cultural pressure to process experience through sharing, the internal voice, the one that knows things before it can explain them, rarely gets the silence it needs to become audible. When it does get that silence, it tends to say things that are surprisingly clear. The second element is a practice of retrospective honesty. Looking back at the moments in your life when you knew something was right or wrong before you had the external evidence to support that knowing and noticing how it turned out. Not to build a mythology of infallibility, to build an accurate empirical record of what your internal signals have actually been worth. Most people, when they do this honestly, find that their early instincts were more reliable than they gave themselves credit for in the moment. The problem was not the signal. The problem was the noise of other people's uncertainty drowning it out before they could act on it. The third element is what might be called commitment practice. Making small decisions based primarily on internal conviction and then staying with those decisions long enough to see what they actually produce, rather than immediately revisiting them the moment they encounter friction or social resistance. The approval loop is reinforced every time you reverse a decision in response to external pressure. The internal compass is reinforced every time you hold a considered position through the discomfort of being temporarily misunderstood. Temporarily is the operative word. Because one of the most important things to understand about the tolerance gap is that it is not permanent. It is a phase, a long one sometimes, an uncomfortable one almost always, but a phase nonetheless. The gap that feels defining in the middle of your transition looks different from the far side of it. And understanding what the far side actually looks like, what it feels like to have moved through the gap and arrived somewhere that the earlier version of you could not have imagined, is where this entire journey has been quietly heading. There is a day that comes, though you cannot schedule it or manufacture it or rush it into being. It arrives quietly, without announcement, the way most of the important things do. You are in a conversation, or perhaps you are alone somewhere unremarkable, a kitchen, a car, a walk you have taken 100 times, and something shifts in your perception. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic clarity of a movie moment where the music swells and the meaning becomes obvious. More like the moment your eyes adjust in a dim room and you realize you can see clearly now and cannot remember exactly when the adjustment happened. You realize that you are no longer waiting. Not waiting for permission. Not waiting for understanding. Not waiting for the version of yourself that will finally feel legitimate enough to move without requiring external ratification. You are simply moving, have been moving for some time now, and the moving has become its own confirmation. Not because you have arrived at some final destination, but because the act of sustained forward motion in alignment with your own examined values has produced something in you that no amount of external validation ever quite managed to produce. A quiet, undefended sense of your own authority. This is what the far side of the tolerance gap feels like, and it is worth describing carefully because the anticipation of it is one of the things that makes the middle of the gap navigable, not as a fantasy, not as a promise, but as an accurate description of what the compound interest of sustained self-trust actually produces, given enough time and enough honest reckoning with the cost of not trusting yourself. The first thing you notice on the far side is that the need for explanation has largely dissolved. Not because you have become indifferent to other people or incurious about their perspectives, but because you have stopped needing explanation to be the bridge between your internal reality and your ability to act. You can hold a clear conviction and encounter a room full of skepticism and feel the skepticism without being destabilized by it. The skepticism becomes information, sometimes useful, sometimes not, rather than a verdict. That shift is not arrogance. It is the precise opposite of arrogance. Arrogance is the defensive performance of certainty by someone who is actually terrified of being wrong. What we are describing is something quieter, the genuine ease of someone who has developed enough of a track record with their own judgment that they no longer need to perform certainty for an audience. They can afford to be uncertain about specifics because they are certain about their own capacity to navigate uncertainty. That is a fundamentally different relationship with the world. The second thing you notice is who is still in the room, because the tolerance gap over time does its sorting work. The relationships that were built on shared circumstance and mutual familiarity with a version of you that no longer fully exists, those have found their natural distance, not with bitterness, not with dramatic rupture in most cases, just with the organic loosening that happens when two people's lives diverge genuinely enough that the connective tissue between them has to find new anchors or gradually release. And the relationships that remain are different in quality from almost anything you experienced before the gap widened. Because the people who stayed, who remained genuinely present through the disorienting middle chapter, who found ways to remain curious about who you were becoming rather than simply mourning who you had been, those people know something about you that the people who knew you only in your more predictable years never quite had access to. They know you under pressure, they know you in uncertainty, they know you in the specific, unglamorous, psychologically demanding work of becoming someone that your earlier self could not have fully articulated. And their presence on the other side of that process is not the comfortable familiarity of old friendship. It is something richer and more honest and considerably more rare. It is the experience of being known at depth by people who chose that knowledge freely during a period when you were not especially easy to know. That quality of connection is one of the quiet rewards of having moved through the gap rather than around it. The third thing you notice, and perhaps the most surprising, is that you have become more understandable. Not because you changed your message or simplified your vision, or finally found the magic framing that made your choices legible to everyone around you, but because time passed and the world moved, and some of the people who could not follow you into the gap have now arrived somewhere closer to where you were standing when the distance first appeared. Growth, when it is genuine, is often simply early. The ideas you were working with, the risks you were willing to take, the standards you were beginning to hold yourself to. These things that seemed strange or excessive or necessarily complicated when you first articulated them tend to look different 5 years later. Not always, but often enough that the person who could not understand your choice to leave a stable career for uncertain but aligned work may, a few years on, be making a version of that same choice themselves. The person who thought your financial priorities were extreme may have arrived through their own experience at a similar set of conclusions. The gap does not always mean you were wrong. Sometimes it just means you were early. And there is something quietly generous about understanding that, because it means the misunderstanding was never really about you and them in any permanent sense. It was about timing, about where each of you happened to be standing when a particular question became unavoidable. You encountered it first. They encountered it later. The understanding arrived, just not on the schedule you would have chosen. This is what it means to be comfortable being misunderstood. Not comfortable in the sense of indifferent, not comfortable in the sense of having closed yourself off from the pain of disconnection. Comfortable in the sense of having developed enough relationship with your own internal compass that the absence of external confirmation no longer reads as evidence of being wrong. Comfortable in the sense of trusting the timing of understanding, knowing that genuine alignment between where you are and what the people around you can see tends to arrive, not always, but more often than fear would have you believe. The tolerance gap is not a wound to be healed. It is a passage to be moved through, and the people who move through it with their humanity intact, who come out the other side neither hardened into isolation nor softened back into compliance, those people carry something in them that is difficult to name, but immediately recognizable when you encounter it. A kind of settledness, a quality of presence that does not require the room to confirm it. An ease with their own complexity that makes other people feel paradoxically more at ease with their own. They have stopped performing certainty and started inhabiting it. They have stopped managing other people's perceptions of their journey and started simply living the journey openly, without apology, and without the exhausting pretense that growth is supposed to be universally understood in real time. They have learned, in the most useful sense of that word, to be misunderstood. And in learning that, they have freed up something enormous. The energy that was perpetually allocated to translation, to explanation, to the management of other people's comfort with their growth. That energy is now available for the thing it was always meant for. The work itself, the actual building, the real relationships, the version of the life that was always on the other side of the need for everyone to understand it first. That version is not a reward for arriving somewhere final. It is available right now, in the middle of everything, to anyone willing to stop waiting for the understanding to precede the movement. The movement is the understanding. It always was. There is something worth sitting with as this comes to a close. You came to this listening carrying something. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of being slightly out of sync with the people around you. Maybe it was the specific fatigue of translating yourself over and over into a language that fits inside someone else's comfort. Maybe it was something harder to name, a background frequency of doubt about whether the gap you feel is a sign of growth or a sign that something has gone wrong. You know now that the gap is real, that it is normal, that it is not a flaw in you or in the people you love, but the natural and inevitable distance that forms when one person moves forward with genuine conviction while the world around them updates at its own pace. You know that the approval loop has a cost, and you have seen that cost clearly enough that the next time you feel yourself reaching for external ratification before internal conviction, you will recognize the reach for what it is. You know that misunderstanding is not a verdict. That confusion in someone else's eyes is not a compass for your direction. That the people who matter will find their way to understanding in time, and the ones who don't were never really responding to you in the first place. And you know, perhaps most importantly, that the energy you reclaim when you stop spending it on translation, on managing, explaining, softening, pre-editing, justifying, that energy belongs to the work, to the life, to the version of yourself that does not require a unanimous vote before it is allowed to exist fully. That version is not waiting for you somewhere in the future. It is the one that has been moving all along, underneath everything, patient and clear and entirely capable of the distance still ahead. Trust it, not blindly, not arrogantly, not in the absence of honest reflection and genuine openness to the people and feedback that actually serve your growth. But trust it. The gap between who you are and who the world currently sees is not a problem. It is the proof that you are already on your way.